The weight of words, the confrontation. Her face, pale and stricken, was a stark contrast to the woman I had once known. She looked like a cornered animal, torn between fight and flight, but I gave her no room for either. I stood still, the silence, between us as sharp as broken glass. "You could have told me," I repeated, my voice steadier this time. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her keys slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. A small, inconsequential sound, yet it seemed to echo in the charged air. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, but her eyes betrayed her. They darted to her phone, then to me. And I saw it. The guilt, the fear, and worst of all, the recognition that the game was over. "You do," I said, stepping closer. I held the phone up, its screen black now but still heavy with the truth it carried. "Do you want me to read them to you? Or would you prefer to tell me yourself?" Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment she seemed to shrink before me. Then she straightened, defiance flickering to life in her eyes. "You went through my phone," she said, her voice rising with indignation. Do you even hear yourself? That's a violation of—" "Stop," I interrupted, my tone cold enough to slice through her protests. "Don't you dare try to make this about me. You lied. You cheated. Don't pretend you're the victim here." Her mouth snapped shut, but the defiance remained, warring with guilt and shame in her expression. A painful truth. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that surprised even me. "That's what they all say, isn't it? It had just happened? Like you tripped and fell into someone else's arms." Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "Not yet. I was lonely," she said, her voice cracking. "You've been so distant lately, and that's your excuse." "I was distant." My voice rose, the anger I'd been holding back spilling over. "Do you have any idea how hard I've been working to keep us afloat, to give us a future?" "I didn't want this," she said, her tears spilling over now. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice softer now but no less devastating. "You hurt me in ways I didn't even know were possible." The aftermath. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. She tried to explain, to justify, but her words only deepened the chasm between us. "I didn't plan it," she said, her voice trembling. "It started with work, just talking, confiding in each other. I didn't think it would go this far." "But it did," I said, my tone flat. "And you lied to me every step of the way." She nodded, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am." "Sorry doesn't undo what you've done," I said, standing. "You made choices, and now you have to live with the consequences." A crossroads that night, I slept in the guest room, or rather, I tried to. Sleep was elusive, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak, and a faint lingering thread of love for the woman I thought she was. The next morning we avoided each other, the silence between us more oppressive than any argument. Could have been. I knew I had a decision to make, to try to rebuild what she had broken, or to walk away from the life we had built together. The seed of vengeance. Anger can be a dangerous thing. It takes root deep inside, feeding off the betrayal until it grows into something unrecognizable. That night, as I lay staring at the ceiling of the guest room, the weight of her betrayal pressed on me like a vice. Her apologies had been hollow. Her excuses were weak. She had taken what was sacred and shattered it without a second thought. As the hours stretched into the early morning, I came to a decision. I wouldn't just walk away. That would be too easy for her. No, I would make her understand the pain she had caused me. I would make her feel it in her very bones. Setting. The stage revenge isn't something you rush into. It requires patience, precision, and a touch of subtlety. Over the next few days, I pretended to be the same man I had always been. I let her think I was processing her apologies, considering reconciliation. I let her believe she still had control over the narrative. But in the background, I began laying the groundwork. The first step was information. I gathered every piece of evidence I could, screenshots of her messages, photos, emails. I didn't just want to confront her again. I wanted to have an arsenal of irrefutable proof. I also did my research on Adam, her so-called colleague. He had a wife and 2 young children, a fact that would become very useful to me later. The perfect deception. I started small, dropping hints that I might be willing to forgive her. I bought flowers one evening and left them on the dining table. She found them when she came home, her face lighting up with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. "You're trying," she said softly, her voice tinged with guilt. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "We've been through too much to throw it all away." She reached for my hand and I let her take it, even though the very thought of her touch made my skin crawl. "Patience," I reminded myself. "You'll have your moment." Turning the tables. The next step was to build my own freedom. I began siphoning money from our joint accounts into a separate one she didn't know about. I spoke to a lawyer, ensuring that I had every legal advantage when the time came to act. I also began planting seeds of doubt in her mind. "Are you still texting Adam?" I asked one evening, feigning casual curiosity. Her eyes widened, panic, flickering across her face before she forced a smile. "Of course not," she said. "It's over. I told you that." "Good," I said, nodding. "I just want to make sure we're moving forward." Her relief was palpable, and I couldn't help but feel a twisted satisfaction. The revelation. When the moment came, it was almost too perfect. I invited her to dinner at her favorite restaurant, a place we hadn't been to in months. She dressed up, wearing the red dress I used to love, before it became tainted by the lies she had wrapped herself in. We sat across from each other, the candlelight flickering between us. I let her talk about her day, about work, about the new project she was excited about. I let her believe, for one final moment, that everything was fine. Then I slid the folder across the table. "What's this?" she asked, her smile faltering. "Open it," I said, my voice calm but cold. She hesitated, but curiosity, or perhaps guilt, got the better of her. As she flipped through the pages, her face drained of color. The screenshots, the photos, the timelines, they were all there, laid out with painstaking detail. "I know everything," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I know about Adam. I know about the lies, and now you're going to face the consequences." The fallout. Her reaction was a mix of denial, anger, and desperate pleading. She tried to blame me, then Adam, then the circumstances. But I wasn't interested in her excuses anymore. "I've spoken to his wife," I said, my voice cutting, through her protests. "She knows everything, too." Her eyes widened, panic flooding her expression. "You didn't—" "Oh, I did," I said. "And she's just as furious as I am." The rest of the evening was a blur of raised voices and tears. By the time we left the restaurant, the fragile facade of our marriage was in ruins. The final move, I filed for divorce the next morning, armed with enough evidence to ensure I came out ahead in every way that mattered. Financially, legally, emotionally. I kept the house, the car, everything we had built together. She was left with nothing but the wreckage of her choices. As for Adam, his wife didn't take the news lightly. From what I heard, he lost more than just his marriage. His career suffered, and his reputation was tarnished beyond repair. A new beginning revenge didn't erase the pain, but it gave me a sense of closure. I walked away from the wreckage of our life together with my head held high, knowing I had taken control of a situation that once seemed insurmountable. And as I stepped into my new life, the long game betrayal has a way of twisting everything it touches, but I wasn't content to let it consume me. The night I handed her that folder was only the beginning. My plan wasn't about revenge for the sake of vengeance. It was about making sure she understood deeply and irrevocably the consequences of her actions. She had played with my trust, my love, and my future. Now it was my turn to play, but I would do so with precision. Undermining her world. The first step was subtle. I began to unravel the threads of her carefully constructed life. She thrived on the image of being put together, successful, and admired. I knew her weaknesses, the insecurities she worked so hard to hide, and I used them. At work, whispers began to circulate. A well-placed email sent anonymously hinted at her unprofessional relationships. Nothing overt, just enough to plant doubt in her colleagues' minds. Socially, I began to distance myself from the mutual friends we shared, but not before quietly sharing my side of the story. I didn't embellish or exaggerate. I simply let the truth speak for itself. Her infidelity became an unspoken stain on her reputation, one she couldn't easily wash away. Her ally turns against her Adam. Her lover wasn't spared either. His wife had been eager to confront him, and when I provided her with the evidence, she wasted no time. Their home became a battlefield, and their marriage crumbled under the weight of his betrayal. It didn't take long for Adam to show his true colors. Without the secrecy and thrill, their affair quickly lost its luster. He grew distant, cold, and eventually he ghosted her entirely. The person she had risked everything for was now gone, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of her choices. Moment of realization. She came to see me a few weeks later. I had been expecting it. She looked haggard, her once perfect appearance undone by sleepless nights and constant worry. "Why are you doing this to me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. "I'm not doing anything to you," I said finally. "You did this to yourself." Tears streamed down her face, but they no longer moved me. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice desperate. "I know I hurt you, but why won't you let me fix it?" "Because some things can't be fixed," I replied, my voice steady. "Some mistakes have consequences you can't escape." The final cut, the divorce, was finalized soon after. I walked away with everything I needed to rebuild my life, leaving her to pick up the pieces of hers. But my revenge wasn't about leaving her destitute or broken. It was about ensuring she understood the depth of her betrayal and the price she had to pay for it. In time, I moved on, finding solace in the knowledge that I had faced the storm and come out stronger. As for her, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was struggling to rebuild, but I felt no satisfaction in that. My revenge was complete not because she suffered, but because I reclaimed my life and my dignity, a familiar unease. Months after the divorce was finalized, my life had begun to regain a sense of normalcy. I had rebuilt my routine, reconnected with old friends, and even started to think about the possibility of dating again. The scars of betrayal were still there, but they no longer consumed me. It was during one of these peaceful days that I heard a whisper, a faint, distant echo of my past. A mutual friend, Julia, called me out of the blue. "I hate to bring this up," she began cautiously, "but I thought you should know something." I braced myself. "What is it?" "It's your ex-wife," she said, her tone heavy with discomfort. She's back to her old ways." My grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" "She's seeing someone else now," Julia explained. "But I overheard that she's already cheating on him too. Same pattern, same lies." An unavoidable curiosity, I told myself I didn't care. She was no longer my responsibility. Her choices were her own, and I had done everything to distance myself from her chaos. But the curiosity gnawed at me. I didn't want her back, not by any stretch, but there was something unsettling about knowing she was out there, wreaking havoc in someone else's life. Against my better judgment, I started looking into it. A quick search on social media revealed that she had indeed moved on. Her posts were full of pictures with a man I didn't recognize, a polished, well-dressed type who looked every bit the successful professional. It didn't take much digging to find out his name was Marcus, déjà vu. The more I learned, the more the parallels became apparent. Marcus seemed smitten, his captions full of declarations of love and gratitude for having found his soulmate. But then, there were the inconsistencies. Pictures of her at events Marcus didn't seem to be part of. Comments from other men that were just a little too flirtatious. And then I found it. A post from a different man, a co-worker of hers, tagging her at a late-night dinner. The caption read, "Best company ever." The image hit me like a brick. Her smile was the same, radiant and convincing. She had always been good at putting on a show. An internal battle, a part of me wanted to look away, to let Marcus figure it out on his own. After all, no one had warned me. I had to learn the hard way. But another part of me, perhaps the part that still bore the scars of her betrayal, felt compelled to act. I wrestled with the decision for days, unsure of what the right thing to do was. Would I be interfering in something that wasn't my business? Or would I be saving Marcus from a pain I knew all too well? The confrontation, in the end, I decided to reach out to him. Not to meddle, but to give him the truth. I sent him a message, short and direct. "Hi, Marcus. I know we don't know each other, but I wanted to share something that might be important to you. I'm her name's ex-husband. I don't mean to intrude, but I've noticed some patterns in her behavior that were present during our marriage. If you'd like to talk, I'm here." It was a gamble. He could ignore me, or worse, accuse me of trying to sabotage their relationship. But a few hours later, he replied, "Thanks for reaching out. Can you tell me more?" A painful parallel over. The next week, we spoke a handful of times. I told him about my experience, sharing the evidence I had uncovered during my own marriage. Marcus, to his credit, listened without defensiveness. It didn't take long for him to start noticing the cracks in her story. He found messages on her phone. Her excuses for late nights at work began to crumble. When he finally confronted her, the outcome was predictable. She denied it, then deflected, then cried. But Marcus wasn't as forgiving as I had once been. The fallout, again word got out about their breakup, and it wasn't long before her reputation took another hit. This time, though, I stayed on the sidelines. I felt no satisfaction in watching her spiral further. If anything, it saddened me to see that she hadn't learned. But I also knew this wasn't my burden to carry anymore. A lesson learned in the end, her choices were her own, and so were her consequences. As for me, I moved forward with a clearer understanding of what I wanted and what I deserved. The aftermath for Marcus was a wreck. When we first spoke after his breakup with her, his voice carried the weight of betrayal I knew all too well. "I don't understand how I missed it," he said over the phone one evening. "She seemed so perfect. Too perfect, maybe. How could I have been so blind?" I could hear the anger beneath his words, a mix of frustration at her and at himself. It mirrored the spiral I'd gone through, the endless questioning of what was real and what was a lie. "You're not blind, Marcus," I replied. "She's just skilled. She knows how to make you believe her version of the truth." Picking up the pieces, Marcus's professional life was also shaken by the ordeal. His colleagues had seen their relationship play out publicly on social media, and now they whispered about its abrupt end. His confidence was shattered, his every interaction laced with self-doubt. But he wasn't entirely alone. He had a network of friends who rallied around him, unlike me, who had faced my betrayal largely in isolation. I envied him that support, but I was also glad for him. "I just don't know how to trust anyone anymore," he confessed during one of our calls. "How do you even start over after something like this?" "It takes time," I said, remembering my own journey. "And it takes forgiving yourself for being human." A shared resolve. Our conversations grew less frequent as he started to rebuild. But before we drifted apart, Marcus and I found an odd sort of camaraderie in our shared experiences. One evening, we met for a drink, two men who'd been burned by the same fire. Marcus was younger than me, sharper in some ways, but his eyes carried the same haunted look I'd seen in my own reflection. "I don't want this to define me," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "It won't," I assured him, "but it'll shape you. The key is not letting it make you bitter. Let it make you smarter." Her continued descent. In the weeks that followed, Marcus shared occasional updates about her. She'd tried to reach out to him, of course, first with apologies, then with accusations when he didn't respond. "She's grasping at straws," he said, claiming I misunderstood, that I overreacted. She even said I was controlling her. I nodded knowingly. Classic deflection. She'll twist the narrative however she needs to save face. It was a relief to know Marcus wasn't falling for it. He had cut her off entirely, refusing to engage in her attempts to rewrite the story. Closure. The last time we spoke, Marcus sounded different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. "I'm done letting her live rent-free in my head," he said. "She's not worth it. I've got too much to look forward to." I couldn't help but smile. Good. That's exactly the right attitude. We didn't keep in touch much after that. Marcus moved forward as I had, each of us carrying the lessons of our shared ordeal into our separate lives. A final reflection. Looking back, I realized that helping Marcus wasn't just about him. It was also about me, proving to myself that I could use my experience to make something good come from all the pain. As for her, she continued down her path of destruction, alienating everyone who tried to care about her. But her story wasn't mine anymore. Marcus and I had escaped her web, and while the scars remained, they no longer defined us. The turning point, the night after I found the first clue, her mysterious messages, I knew I couldn't let it rest. Every instinct told me something was off, and though part of me desperately wanted to believe it was all in my head, the evidence was mounting. I decided to act, but cautiously. If I was wrong, I'd need to own that mistake. But if I was right, well, I'd need a plan. Digital shadows, it started with her phone. She had always been careful, but people slip when they think. They're untouchable. One evening, she left it on the kitchen counter while taking a shower. The temptation was unbearable. I unlocked it using her predictable passcode, our anniversary, ironically, and started scrolling. Messages were mostly mundane, but then I noticed one contact, saved under a woman's name, that felt off. The texts were light and seemingly harmless. "Can't wait to see you again." "Last night was amazing." I stared at the words, my stomach nodding. The tone wasn't one you'd use with a casual friend. Planting a seed, I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I started keeping notes. Times she said she'd be somewhere, the names she dropped, and any discrepancies in her stories. When she claimed she was working late, I'd casually drive by her office. Lights off, parking lot empty. When she said she was with friends, I'd text one of them to ask about something unrelated. The answers rarely lined up, but the real breakthrough came when I checked her email. She'd synced it to her tablet, which she hardly ever used. I guessed the password, and there it was, a reservation confirmation for a hotel downtown. The confrontation, it was a Friday night when I decided to confront her. I didn't want an argument, I wanted the truth. I waited until she came home, setting the tablet on the table in plain view. She walked in, smiling like nothing was wrong, but her expression froze when she saw it. "What's this?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. Her eyes darted to the screen, then back to me. "It's nothing," she said too quickly. "Just a work thing." "A work thing?" I repeated, holding up the reservation. "Does your work require a hotel room for two, under a fake name?" Her defense crumbles, she stammered, searching for an explanation. But I saw it, the moment she realized she couldn't talk her way out of this. "I can explain," she began, but I cut her off. "Don't. Just tell me the truth. Who is it?" Her silence was answer enough. When she finally spoke, her words were halting and defensive. "It's not what you think. It didn't mean anything." "That's the best you can do?" I asked, my voice rising. "You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around, and it didn't mean anything?" "The full picture," she admitted. To the affair, though she downplayed its significance. It was just physical, she claimed, and it was over now. But the more questions I asked, the more her story unraveled. It wasn't over, not even close. I learned about the dinners, the weekends I thought she was at work, the excuses that no longer held up. Each revelation was a punch to the gut, but I kept pushing, needing to know how deep the betrayal went. The final straw, when I mentioned hiring a private investigator, her face went pale. That's when I knew I had her. "You hired someone to follow." "Me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," I replied, though the idea was tempting. "But now I know I'd find even more if I did." She broke down then, sobbing and begging for forgiveness. But I couldn't bring myself to comfort her, not this time. What next? I spent the night replaying everything in my head, weighing my options. Divorce seemed inevitable, but part of me wanted her to feel the consequences of what she'd done before walking away. The next morning, I began planning my next move. Uncovering the depths, the confrontation was just the beginning. Her confession was full of half-truths, carefully selected to minimize the damage and avoid further questions. But her lies had only fueled my resolve to dig deeper. I needed to know everything. Not because I wanted to hurt myself with the details, but because understanding the full scope of her betrayal would give me clarity. The private investigator. After much deliberation, I decided to hire a private investigator. It felt extreme, but I knew her story didn't add up. If I was going to protect myself, I needed hard evidence, not just suspicions and emotional confrontations. The investigator, a seasoned professional named Carla, had a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. "Cheaters are creatures of habit," she told me during our first meeting. "They fall into routines, and routines leave trails. If she's still seeing him, we'll find out." Following the trail, Carla worked quickly. Within days, she had tracked down the man my wife had been meeting, David, a colleague from a neighboring company. Married. 2 kids. "He's as much a liar as she is," Carla said, sliding a manila folder across the table to me. Inside were photos, the 2 of them walking into a boutique hotel hand in hand, a shot of her car parked outside his house late at night, a grainy image of them laughing together in a restaurant I'd never been to. Seeing it all laid out like that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. The digital footprint. Carla also uncovered a trove of digital evidence. Text messages, emails, even a secret social media account she used to communicate with him. The messages were damning. "Miss you already. Counting down until Friday night. You make me feel alive in a way I haven't in years." Each word hit harder than the last. The intimacy in their exchanges was a stark contrast to the distance she had shown me in recent months. A hidden account one evening. While combing through the information Carla had provided, I discovered something even more shocking: a separate bank account. She'd been withdrawing small amounts of cash regularly, likely to fund her secret rendezvous. It wasn't just the affair. She had been siphoning money from our joint finances to keep it hidden. Confronting the truth, by the time Carla had finished her investigation, I had a comprehensive timeline of her betrayal. Every lie, every stolen moment, every dollar spent. It was all there in black and white. I sat in my car that night, staring at the folder in my lap, torn between anger and heartbreak. This is who she really is, I thought, the weight of it sinking in, and I never saw it coming. Next steps, I had the evidence I needed, but the question remained. What would I do with it? Divorce was the obvious choice, but a part of me wanted more than just to walk away. I wanted her to face the full weight of her actions, digging deeper. After that fateful confrontation, I realized I had only scratched the surface. The more I learned, the more I understood that she had been operating in a world of secrets for far longer than I'd suspected. My anger was a fire that wouldn't be extinguished until I uncovered every lie. I decided to dig deeper, methodically and deliberately, to uncover the full extent of her betrayal. Unveiling the trail. The first step was her digital life. I spent hours combing through her social media accounts, looking for patterns. She had been careful, but no one is flawless. Photos and posts with cryptic captions stood out. Dates didn't align with where she claimed to be. A few innocuous-looking comments from a man I didn't recognize seemed innocuous at first glance, but they carried a familiarity that set off alarms. I reverse-searched his profile and found a goldmine. He had tagged her in several photos, but they were hidden from her timeline. Dinner dates, a weekend trip labeled as a work conference, a private investigator. The breadcrumbs I'd gathered pointed to something bigger, but I needed concrete proof, evidence that couldn't be dismissed or spun into another lie. That's when I decided to bring in a professional. Hiring a private investigator felt dramatic, but it was the right choice. Within a week, he had photographs, timestamps, and locations that confirmed everything I feared. The man she'd been seeing was married too, adding another layer of deceit to the tangled mess. The investigator found out they'd been meeting during her overtime shifts, and even had a favorite boutique hotel where they frequently rendezvoused. The hidden finances. While the private investigator worked, I turned my attention to our finances. If she was hiding one part of her life, there was a good chance she was hiding more. Sure enough, I found unexplained charges on our joint credit card, spa appointments she'd never mentioned, jewelry I'd never seen, and hotel bookings under fake names. The patterns painted a picture of someone living a double life. Confronting her lies when I confronted her with the evidence, photos, receipts, and records, her reaction was explosive. "You had me followed?" she screamed, deflecting the blame onto me. "You invaded my privacy!" "You lost the right to privacy the moment you started lying," I shot back. "This isn't about me. It's about you. It's about what you've done to us." Her excuses came fast and furious, but they were hollow. She tried to shift blame to justify her actions, but I saw through every word. A deeper connection. What hurt the most wasn't just the physical betrayal. It was the emotional bond they seemed to share. The messages I found spoke of dreams and plans that didn't include me. He wasn't just a fling. He was someone she had let into the space that should have been ours alone. It was a betrayal on every level. The final piece. The last piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected place. Her best friend. We'd always gotten along well, and when I mentioned the affair, her face told me she knew. She told me she wasn't happy. Her friend admitted hesitantly. But I didn't think she'd go this far. I didn't think she'd... Her words trailed off. But they confirmed what I'd suspected. Her dissatisfaction had been building for a long time, and instead of confronting it, she'd chosen to escape. The next step With all the evidence in hand, I felt strangely calm. There were no more doubts, no more what-ifs. I knew the truth, and now it was time to decide what to do with it. The plan for revenge. The evidence Carla provided wasn't just proof. It was power. I held in my hands a detailed record of every deception, every stolen moment, every dollar funneled into her double life. She had betrayed me not only emotionally, but financially and morally. Now, I would turn her lies against her. Setting the stage, I began by carefully planning my approach. This wasn't going to be a reckless, emotional confrontation. I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions in a way that left no room for her to twist the narrative or deflect the blame. Step 1. Legal preparation. I met with a divorce attorney, a sharp, relentless woman named Evelyn, who had seen every kind of betrayal under the sun. She's exposed herself in multiple ways, Evelyn said, flipping through the evidence. The financial mismanagement alone could be grounds for a favorable settlement, not to mention the infidelity. Step 2. Strategic timing. I waited until she was most vulnerable, when she was comfortable, confident that I had either forgiven her or chosen to overlook her betrayal. The anniversary dinner, I planned the confrontation for our wedding anniversary. I knew it was cruel, but it was fitting. She had suggested dinner at a fancy restaurant, her attempt at normalcy, perhaps even reconciliation. I agreed, but with a hidden agenda. That evening, I dressed sharply, outwardly calm but inwardly seething. I brought a gift, a beautifully wrapped box that held not love, but the weight of her lies. When we sat down at the table, she seemed nervous but hopeful. "You look nice tonight," she said, her smile hesitant. "So do you," I replied, my tone even. I wasn't ready to tip my hand just yet. Unwrapping the truth. Halfway through dinner, after the wine had been poured and the small talk had run dry, I slid the box across the table to her. "What's this?" she asked, her eyes lighting up with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Open it," I said simply. She tore the wrapping paper slowly, as if savoring the moment. But when she lifted the lid and saw what was inside, a stack of photos, printouts, of her messages and copies of the financial transactions, her face drained of color. "What is this?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's the truth," I said, leaning forward. "The truth you've been hiding from me for months." Her desperation. She tried to deny it at first, her voice trembling as she fumbled for excuses. "This isn't what it looks like," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I can explain." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice cold. "You've already said enough lies. I'm not here for your excuses. I'm here to tell you that this is over." Her tears turned to panic as she realized the depth of what I had uncovered. She begged, pleaded, promised it would never happen again. But her words were empty, and I didn't flinch. "You didn't just betray me," I said, my voice low and steady. "You betrayed everything we built together, and now you'll face the consequences." The fallout, I left her there, stunned and broken, while I walked out into the crisp night air. The next day, I filed for divorce, armed with the irrefutable evidence Carla had gathered. Evelyn assured me the settlement would favor me, and she was right. Her reputation took a hit, too. When her affair became public knowledge, thanks to a carefully worded email I sent to a few select individuals, her social circle shrank quickly. The man she had been seeing. His wife found out, and their family imploded. Freedom and closure for the first time in months, I felt free. The weight of her lies no longer hung over me. I poured my energy into rebuilding my life, focusing on my career, my friends, and my own happiness. Revenge didn't undo the pain she caused, but it gave me a sense of justice. She had played with my heart and my trust, and in the end, she had nothing left but the consequences of her own actions. The search for truth. After my initial suspicions, my days were consumed with an obsessive need to uncover the truth. Every glance, every odd text notification on her phone, every unexplained late meeting, it all screamed of deceit. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. I needed evidence, cold and undeniable, to confront her and protect myself from the emotional web she had spun. The phone incident one evening, she left her phone on the kitchen counter as she stepped out to grab something from her car. It buzzed, once, then twice. My eyes instinctively darted to the screen. The name displayed was Lisa, a friend she rarely mentioned, but the preview of the message wasn't casual. It read, "I can't wait to see you tomorrow. Last night was incredible." My stomach dropped. I stared at the phone, torn between wanting to unlock it and the moral weight of invading her privacy. But in that moment, her betrayal felt like a much greater crime. The lock screen passcode was the same as her ATM PIN, a habit I had teased her about in the past. My hands shook as I typed it in. The phone unlocked, and what I found confirmed my worst fears. The messages. The conversation with Lisa wasn't a chat with a friend. It was a string of intimate messages exchanged with someone she clearly had a deep connection to. The photos, the affectionate nicknames, the plans for secret meetings, they painted a picture of a relationship that had been going on for months. The text history showed they met at a nearby cafe every Wednesday afternoon, when she was supposed to be at her yoga class. The betrayal was deliberate, calculated. The journal later that evening, while she was asleep, I remembered something she had always kept private, her journal. It sat on her bedside table, a leather-bound book she claimed was her place to sort through her thoughts. I opened it, and there, in her own handwriting, were entries that detailed her internal struggle. "I know it's wrong, but with him I feel alive. Marcus doesn't look at me the way he used to. I don't even know if he loves me anymore." The words cut deep. She hadn't just cheated on me physically. She had rewritten our story, casting me as the neglectful, unloving husband in her mind to justify her actions. The final straw. The next week, I followed her. On Wednesday, instead of going to yoga, she drove to the cafe. From a distance, I watched her walk in, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. Minutes later, a man joined her at the table, a tall, confident figure with an easy laugh. They sat close, their hands brushing across the table. I felt like an outsider in my own life, watching the woman I had loved for years share her affection with someone else. The confrontation. Looms armed with the messages, her journal entries, and the damning sight of her with him, I prepared for the confrontation. But something inside me shifted. It wasn't just anger, it was a deep sense of resolve. If she had unraveled the fabric of our life together, I would take control of what came next. This wasn't just about confronting her, it was about reclaiming my own narrative. The confrontation. The day had come. The moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat on the edge of the bed, the folder of evidence resting in my lap. I stared at the door, waiting for her to come home. The silence of the house felt oppressive, the air thick with the weight of the truth I was about to unveil. Her key turned in the door, the familiar sound of her return. I stood up, my body stiff with a mixture of determination and dread. I could feel the rage simmering beneath my calm exterior, but I refused to let it show just yet. I would control this moment. This would be my reckoning. She entered, a smile on her face, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing. She paused when she saw me standing there, the air between us charged with tension. "Hey, what's going on?" "You look different," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Sit down," I said, my voice firm, devoid of the warmth she had become accustomed to. Her brow furrowed as she moved cautiously toward the couch. She sat down, her eyes darting between me and the folder in my hands. "What's this about?" Her voice faltered. I placed the folder on the coffee table, sliding it toward her with deliberate slowness. The sound of paper shifting echoed in the silence. The weight of what I was about to show her hung in the air like a blade about to fall. She looked at the folder, then back at me. Her expression shifted. Just a flicker of recognition, of fear, before she masked it with a forced calm. "Why are you—" I interrupted her, my voice colder than I had ever heard it before. "Don't make excuses, just open it." She hesitated for a moment, and then, with trembling fingers, she opened the folder. The first thing she saw was a series of photos. Her, laughing with him, the same man I had seen at the cafe. Her eyes flicked to me, then back to the photos, but she didn't say a word. I watched her face as the pieces fell into place, the realization dawning in her eyes. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. "How long?" I asked, my voice steady but heavy with the weight of the question. "Marcus, Her voice faltered. She was trying to form words, but they were tangled in the web of lies she had spun. I sat down across from her, folding my arms across my chest. "Don't bother lying. I already know everything. The texts, the meetings, the money you've been siphoning for him, and your journal. Everything." Her face turned pale, the blood draining from her cheeks. The woman who had always prided herself on her composure was crumbling in front of me, and I couldn't help but feel a cold, distant satisfaction in seeing her vulnerability. "You really thought I wouldn't find out?" I continued. "You really thought you could have a second life and I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't feel the distance between us? I never meant for it to happen," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was confused, I felt neglected, and he made me feel alive again. I'm sorry." The words were empty, and she knew it. Her apology was an attempt to absolve herself, to make it sound like a mere mistake. But it wasn't. It was calculated. It was betrayal. "You're sorry?" I said, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Sorry that you got caught, I presume." Her eyes filled with tears as she reached for me, but I pulled back, not wanting to be touched. Not now. Not ever again. "This isn't just about you," I said, my voice growing colder. "This is about us, everything we built, everything you destroyed for a fleeting moment of validation. And now, you expect me to just forgive you because you're sorry?" She stood, her hands outstretched, but I stood as well, the power in the room shifting. "I didn't just lose trust, you know. I lost respect for who you are, for what you've become." The fallout. Her pleading continued, but I tuned it out. I had reached a breaking point, a place where words no longer held any weight. I had been betrayed on every level, and now I needed to protect myself, to make sure she couldn't walk away without facing the consequences. The divorce papers were served that same week. I watched her eyes fill with panic as she saw the papers on the table. Her frantic explanations were met with silence. There was nothing left to say. I had already seen who she was, and I no longer wanted to be a part of her world. When the papers were filed, I made sure to include everything, every financial discrepancy, every secret meeting, and every detail of the affair. I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. This wasn't just about ending our marriage. It was about forcing her to confront the full consequences of her actions. The aftermath of the betrayal was more than just legal proceedings. It affected everything. Our friends, our families, the people who had once believed in our union. The truth, once exposed, couldn't be ignored. She had lost it all: her reputation, my trust, and my love. There were days when the darkness felt overwhelming, when I thought I would never be the same again. That's when I decided to seek help. Therapy became a vital tool for understanding the depth of my emotions. It wasn't just about working through the anger or the sadness, but about understanding the patterns of my past, the choices I had made, and the reasons behind my own blind spots. I learned that healing wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about making peace with it. Through therapy, I began to unravel the parts of me that had been clouded by the betrayal. I learned to forgive myself, not because I was at fault, but because holding on to resentment and self-blame would only perpetuate the cycle of pain. It was hard, especially on the days when I would cry for the life I had lost. But it was necessary. Each tear that fell was a release, and with each session, I started to understand the depth of my own worth, untethered from her actions. Rediscovery. Finding myself again. As the months passed, I felt myself emerge from the fog. I started taking long walks in the park, breathing in the crisp air like it was my first time. The simple act of moving through the world without the weight of betrayal on my shoulders was freeing. The world didn't feel like it was closing in on me anymore. It felt vast, filled with possibility. I spent more time with friends, those who had supported me through the toughest moments. Their laughter, their companionship, reminded me of who I was before I had become entangled in a toxic relationship. They helped me see the parts of myself that had been suppressed for so long, the parts that still loved life, still cared deeply for others, still had the capacity for joy. I started dating again, tentatively at first. The fear of being hurt, again, was always there, lurking in the corners of my mind. But I reminded myself that each person was their own individual, not a replica of the one who had betrayed me. And with time, I learned to trust again. Not completely, but enough to open my heart. Forgiveness and acceptance. It wasn't until I found a moment of complete stillness, sitting alone in a cafe watching people go about their day, that I realized I had forgiven her. Not for her sake, but for mine. Holding on to anger and hatred had kept me shackled to the past. Letting go wasn't about excusing her actions, it was about freeing myself from the grip of resentment. I had accepted what happened, but more importantly, I had accepted that I was worthy of love and respect. My value was not defined by someone else's actions. I was not a victim of her choices. I was a survivor of my own. The future. A new beginning with time, I realized that the end of that chapter didn't signal the end of my story. In fact, it was the beginning of something entirely new. The man I had become was stronger, more aware of his own boundaries, and more grateful for the opportunities that life still had to offer. I learned that healing wasn't linear. It didn't follow a strict path or timetable. It was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes it felt like I would never get back to where I once was. But I did. And I did so much more than that. I grew. I rebuilt. I flourished. And in the quiet of a new dawn, I realized something profound. I was whole again. 2. The importance of self-worth. The betrayal left me questioning my own value. I wondered, was I not enough? Did I fail her in some way? For a time, I believed her actions were a reflection of my inadequacy. But eventually, I realized that the betrayal was not about me at all. It was about her, her choices, her actions, and it had nothing to do with my worth. I had given so much of myself to the relationship, so much that I had lost sight of who I was beyond her. This was the lesson. I needed to learn I am enough. I don't need validation from anyone else, and I certainly don't need to justify my existence to someone who could betray me so easily. From the pain of betrayal, I found a deeper connection with myself. I became my own priority. I learned to nurture my self-worth, not in a selfish or narcissistic way, but in a way that allowed me to value my happiness, my dreams, and my needs as equal to those of others. 3. Boundaries are not a sign of weakness, but strength. For much of our marriage, I had allowed the boundaries between us to blur. I had given without asking for much in return, believing that love required self-sacrifice. But love, I learned, should never come at the cost of losing yourself. In the aftermath of the betrayal, I was forced to set boundaries, not just with her, but with myself. I began to understand that having boundaries was not a form of selfishness, but a means of protecting my emotional integrity. It was a declaration that I would no longer tolerate mistreatment, that my peace of mind was as important as anyone else's. I learned to say no without guilt. I learned to stand up for my needs, to assert my values, and to walk away from situations that threatened my well-being. Those boundaries became my shield, my line in the sand, and with time, I found that they only made me stronger and more grounded. 4. Pain is temporary, but growth is permanent. In the throes of the betrayal, I couldn't fathom how I would ever feel whole again. The pain was overwhelming, a constant ache in my chest that felt like it would never subside. But time, as it always does, worked its quiet magic. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the pain began to fade. The hole she left in me began to heal. I learned that pain, as intense as it is in the moment, is temporary. Growth, however, is a lasting transformation. What I had endured didn't define me. It shaped me. And the lessons learned from the betrayal became stepping stones that guided me toward a better version of myself. While the scars of the betrayal will always be there, they are no longer wounds. They are reminders of how far I've come, of how resilient I am, and of the strength I found in the darkest of times. 5. People change, but that doesn't mean you have to. One of the hardest truths I had to accept was that people do change. But what I also learned is that you don't have to change with them. She had changed over time, drifting away, losing her sense of commitment, her connection to the love we once shared. I couldn't stop her from evolving into someone unrecognizable. But I didn't have to follow that same path. I didn't have to let her betrayal change who I was at my core. I learned to stay true to myself, even in the face of someone else's transformation. Her actions didn't dictate my own, and I realized that the power to shape my future lay within me. I could choose to grow, yes, but I would grow on my own terms, not based on the whims of someone else's choices. 6. You can love again, but only when you love yourself first. There was a time when I believed that love was something external, something that needed to be given by someone else to complete me. But I was wrong. The betrayal shattered the illusion that love would somehow fulfill me or define me. I had to learn that love in its truest form starts from within. Once I had rebuilt my self-worth, learned to set boundaries, and rediscovered my passions, I realized that the capacity for love was still within me, but it had to come from a place of strength, not desperation. I learned that loving someone else begins with loving yourself, not in an arrogant or self-centered way, but in a way that honors who you are and what you deserve. And so I began to open my heart again, not as a response to the past, but as an active choice to welcome new possibilities into my life. 7. Forgiveness is freedom. The final lesson, the most profound one, was that forgiveness, true, genuine forgiveness, was my ticket to freedom. It didn't absolve her of her actions. It didn't erase the betrayal. But it freed me from the heavy chains of anger and resentment that had kept me shackled for so long. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't about letting her off the hook. It was about letting go of the hold that pain had on my soul. It was about choosing peace over bitterness, understanding that holding on to the past would only keep me tethered to it. 1. Trust must be earned, not assumed. The betrayal had taught me a painful but undeniable truth. Trust is not an inherent part of any relationship, but something that must be nurtured and carefully maintained. Before the betrayal, I had believed that simply being with someone for a long time meant trust was an automatic and unspoken part of the bond. How could she lie to me if we had shared everything? I thought. But when the truth shattered my world, I saw how fragile trust can be, how quickly it can be taken for granted, and how easily it can be broken. I had failed to notice the subtle cracks, the late-night phone calls, the unexplained absences, the vague answers when I asked about certain things. I had assumed that love alone was enough to keep us solid. As time passed after the divorce, I began to understand that trust isn't something to be assumed. It's something to be continually proven. It's built through consistent actions, shared values, and an unwavering commitment to honesty. I started approaching new relationships with this newfound clarity. Every action, every word was a piece of evidence, a building block either reinforcing trust or showing cracks. It didn't make me paranoid, but it made me more observant. I learned that while love is a powerful force, trust needs active, conscious effort to thrive. I refused to let anyone take it for granted again. 2. The importance of self-worth. At first, I couldn't see beyond the betrayal. What was wrong with me? That question haunted me more than I cared to admit. When the woman I had trusted, loved, and shared my life with had betrayed me, I could not help but feel diminished. Every word of her apology, every tear she shed, was an attempt to assuage the guilt that gnawed at her. But in those moments, what I needed most wasn't her remorse. It was a reconnection to myself. I learned that the damage done to my heart was a reflection of her choices, not my inadequacy. I had mistakenly tied my value to someone else's love, believing that I was worthy only if I was loved in return. That's when the real healing began. I had to rediscover my own worth, independent of anyone's opinion or actions. The journey wasn't easy. It involved hours of staring into the mirror, asking myself who I was outside of the labels I had placed on myself: husband, partner, provider. It meant taking time to look at my own achievements, my own passions, and remembering that I had been a whole person before her. I began to nurture my self-worth not through validation from others, but by appreciating my own efforts, understanding my needs, and respecting my own boundaries. It was a slow process, but with every small step, I felt the deepening connection to myself. I realized that self-worth was not something that could be given to me, nor could it be stripped away by someone else. It was mine to cultivate, to protect, and to cherish. 3. Boundaries are not a sign of weakness, but strength. In the past, I had been afraid of setting boundaries, fearing it would make me seem distant or demanding. I believed love meant sacrifice, giving all of myself to the relationship without asking for much in return. But I learned the hard way that boundaries are not walls to keep people out. They are the parameters that keep us safe, respected, and emotionally healthy. When the betrayal occurred, it became painfully clear how easily I had allowed my own needs and desires to be subsumed by the relationship. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind, my needs for solitude, my desire for clear communication, because I believed it was easier to bend than to confront the uncomfortable truth of the situation. Post-divorce, I had to teach myself that setting boundaries wasn't an act of selfishness or weakness, it was an act of self-love. I began to identify the things that made me feel safe, valued, and respected. Whether it was in relationships or friendships, I realized I had every right to speak up when my boundaries were being tested. For example, I stopped tolerating disrespectful behavior, whether it was small dismissive comments or larger actions like broken promises. I learned to say no without guilt when something didn't sit right with me, even if it meant disappointing someone else. The more I honored my boundaries, the more I felt my sense of self-preservation and dignity returning. They became my armor, protecting my emotional integrity And in the process, I discovered a quiet, unshakable strength within me. 4. Pain is temporary, but growth is permanent. When the betrayal first hit, I had no idea how I would survive it. The emotional pain was excruciating, and it felt like a physical weight on my chest, suffocating me at times. There were days when I didn't want to get out of bed, when I thought the world would never feel right again. I mourned the future I thought we had, the dreams I had held onto so tightly.